I see you are a determined rationalist, said the lady. Did you not hear me say that I have had experiences even more terrible? I too was once a skeptic, but after what I have known, I can no longer affect to doubt. Madam, replied Mr. Phillips, no one shall make me deny my faith. I will never believe, nor will I pretend to believe, that two and two make five, nor will I on any pretenses admit the existence of two-sided triangles. You are a little hasty, rejoined the lady. But may I ask you if you ever heard the name of Professor Gregg, the authority on ethnology and kindred subjects? I have done much more than merely hear of Professor Gregg, said Phillips. I always regarded him as one of our most acute and clear-headed observers, and his last publication, the textbook of ethnology, struck me as being quite admirable in its kind. Indeed, the book had but come into my hands when I heard of the terrible accident which cut short Gregg's career. He had, I think, taken a country house in the west of England for the summer, and is supposed to have fallen into a river. So far as I remember, his body was never recovered. Sir, I am sure that you are discreet. Your conversation seems to declare as much, and the very title of that little work of yours which you mentioned assures me that you are no empty trifler. In a word, I feel that I may depend on you. You appear to be under the impression that Professor Gregg is dead. I have no reason to believe that that is the case. What? Cried Phillips, astonished and perturbed. You do not hint that there was anything disgraceful? I cannot believe it. Gregg was a man of clearest character. His private life was one of great benevolence. And though I myself am free from delusions, I believe him to have been a sincere and devout Christian. Surely you cannot mean to insinuate that some disreputable history forced him to flee the country. Again you are in a hurry, replied the lady. I said nothing of all this. Briefly, then, I must tell you that Professor Gregg left this house one morning in full health both in mind and body. He never returned, but his watch and chain, a purse containing 3 sovereigns in gold and some loose silver, with a ring that he wore habitually, were found 3 days later on a wild and savage hillside, many miles from the river. These articles were placed beside a limestone rock of fantastic form. They had been wrapped into a parcel with a kind of rough parchment which was secured with gut. The parcel was opened, and the inner side of the parchment bore an inscription done with some red substance. The characters were undecipherable, but seemed to be a corrupt cuneiform. You interest me intensely, said Phillips. Would you mind continuing your story? The circumstance you have mentioned seems to me of the most inexplicable character, and I thirst for an elucidation. The young lady seemed to meditate for a moment, and she then proceeded to relate the novel of the Black Seal. I must now give you some fuller particulars of my history. I am the daughter of a civil engineer, Stephen Lally by name, who was so unfortunate as to die suddenly at the outset of his career, and before he had accumulated sufficient means to support his wife and her 2 children. My mother contrived to keep the small household going on resources which must have been incredibly small. We lived in a remote country village, because most of the necessaries of life were cheaper than in a town, but even so we were brought up with the severest economy. My father was a clever and well-read man, and left behind him a small but select collection of books, containing the best Greek, Latin, and English classics, and these books were the only amusement we possessed. My brother, I remember, learnt Latin out of Descartes' Meditations, and I, in place of the little tales which children are usually told to read, had nothing more charming than a translation of the Gesta Romanorum. We grew up thus, quiet and studious children, and in course of time my brother provided for himself in the manner I have mentioned. I continued to live at home. My poor mother had become an invalid and demanded my continual care, and about 2 years ago she died after many months of painful illness. My situation was a terrible one. The shabby furniture barely sufficed to pay the debts I had been forced to contract, and the books I dispatched to my brother, knowing how he would value them. I was absolutely alone. I was aware how poorly my brother was paid, and though I came up to London in the hope of finding employment, with the understanding that he would defray my expenses, I swore it should only be for a month, and that if I could not in that time find some work I would starve rather than deprive him of the few miserable pounds he had laid by for his day of trouble. I took a little room in a distant suburb, the cheapest that I could find. I lived on bread and tea, and I spent my time in vain answering of advertisements and vainer walks to addresses I had noted. Day followed on day, and week on week, and still I was unsuccessful, till at last the term I had appointed drew to a close, and I saw before me the grim prospect of slowly dying of starvation. My landlady was good-natured in her way. She knew the slenderness of my means, and I am sure that she would not have turned me out of doors. It remained for me then to go away and to try to die in some quiet place. It was winter then, and a thick white fog gathered in the early part of the afternoon, becoming more dense as the day wore on. It was a Sunday, I remember, and the people of the house were at chapel. At about 3 o'clock I crept out and walked away as quickly as I could, for I was weak from abstinence. The white mist wrapped all the streets in silence. A hard frost had gathered thick upon the bare branches of the trees, and frost crystals glittered on the wooden fences and on the cold, cruel ground beneath my feet. I walked on, turning to right and left in utter haphazard, without caring to look up at the names of the streets, and all that I remember of my walk on that Sunday afternoon seems but the broken fragments of an evil dream. In a confused vision I stumbled on, through roads half town and half country, gray fields melting into the cloudy world of mist on one side of me, and on the other comfortable villas with a glow of firelight flickering on the walls, but all unreal. Red brick walls and lighted windows, vague trees and glimmering country, gas lamps beginning to star the white shadows, the vanishing perspectives of the railway line beneath high embankments, the green and red of the signal lamps. All these were but momentary pictures flashed on my tired brain and senses numbed by hunger. Now and then I would hear a quick step ringing on the iron road, and men would pass me well wrapped up, walking fast for the sake of warmth, and no doubt eagerly foretasting the pleasures of a glowing hearth, with curtains tightly drawn about the frosted panes, and the welcomes of their friends. But as the early evening darkened and night approached, foot passengers got fewer and fewer, and I passed through street after street alone. In the white silence I stumbled on, as desolate as if I trod the streets of a buried city. And as I grew more weak and exhausted, something of the horror of death was folding thickly round my heart. Suddenly, as I turned a corner, someone accosted me courteously beneath the lamppost, and I heard a voice asking if I could kindly point the way to Avon Road. At the sudden shock of human accents I was prostrated, and my strength gave way. I fell all huddled on the sidewalk, and wept and sobbed and laughed in violent hysteria. I had gone out prepared to die, and as I stepped across the threshold that had sheltered me, I consciously bade adieu to all hopes and all remembrances. The door clanged behind me with the noise of thunder, and I felt that an iron curtain had fallen on the brief passage of my life, that henceforth I was to walk a little way in a world of gloom and shadow. I entered on the stage of the first act of death. Then came I wandering in the mist, the whiteness wrapping all things, the void streets, and muffled silence, till when that voice spoke to me it was as if I had died and life returned to me. In a few minutes I was able to compose my feelings, and as I rose I saw that I was confronted by a middle-aged gentleman of pleasing appearance, neatly and correctly dressed. He looked at me with an expression of great pity, but before I could stammer out my ignorance of the neighborhood, for indeed I had not the slightest notion of where I had wandered, he spoke. "My dear madam," he said, "you seem in some terrible distress. You cannot think how you alarmed me. But may I inquire the nature of your trouble? I assure you that you can safely confide in me." "You are very kind," I replied, "but I fear there is nothing to be done. My condition seems a hopeless one." "Oh, nonsense, nonsense. You are too young to talk like that. Come, let us walk down here, and you must tell me your difficulty. Perhaps I may be able to help you." There was something very soothing and persuasive in his manner, and as we walked together I gave him an outline of my story and told of the despair that had oppressed me almost to death. "You were wrong to give in so completely," he said, when I was silent. "A month is too short a time in which to feel one's way in London. London, let me tell you, Miss Lally, does not lie open and undefended. It is a fortified place, fossed and double-moated with curious intricacies. As must always happen in large towns, the conditions of life have become hugely artificial. No mere simple palisade is run up to oppose the man or woman who would take the place by storm, but serried lines of subtle contrivances, mines, and pitfalls which it needs a strange skill to overcome. You, in your simplicity, fancied you had only to shout for these walls to sink into nothingness. But the time is gone for such startling victories as these. Take courage. You will learn the secret of success before very long. Alas, sir, I replied, I have no doubt your conclusions are correct, but at the present moment I seem to be in a fair way to die of starvation. You spoke of a secret. For heaven's sake tell it me, if you have any pity for my distress. He laughed genially. There lies the strangeness of it all. Those who know the secret cannot tell it if they would. It is positively as ineffable as the central doctrine of Freemasonry. But I may say this, that you yourself have penetrated at least the outer husk of the mystery, and he laughed again. Pray do not jest with me, I said. What have I done? Case gazed. I am so far ignorant that I have not the slightest idea of how my next meal is to be provided. Excuse me. You ask what you have done. You have met me. Come, we will fence no longer. I see you have self-education, the only education which is not infinitely pernicious, and I am in want of a governess for my 2 children. I have been a widower for some years. My name is Gregg. I offer you the post I have named, and shall we say a salary of 100 a year? I could only stutter out my thanks, and slipping a card with his address, and a banknote by way of earnest, into my hand. Mr. Gregg bade me goodbye, asking me to call in a day or two. Such was my introduction to Professor Gregg. And can you wonder that the remembrance of despair and the cold blast that had blown from the gates of death upon me made me regard him as a second father? Before the close of the week, I was installed in my new duties. The professor had leased an old brick manor house in a western suburb of London, and here, surrounded by pleasant lawns and orchards, and soothed with the murmur of ancient elms that rocked their boughs above the roof, the new chapter of my life began. Knowing as you do the nature of the professor's occupation, you will not be surprised to hear that the house teemed with books, and cabinets full of strange, and even hideous, objects filled every available nook in the vast low rooms. Gregg was a man whose one thought was for knowledge, and I too before long caught something of his enthusiasm, and strove to enter into his passion of research. In a few months I was perhaps more his secretary than the governess of the 2 children, and many a night I have sat at the desk in the glow of the shaded lamp, while he, pacing up and down in the rich gloom of the firelight, dictated to me the substance of his textbook of ethnology. But amidst these more sober and accurate studies I always detected a something hidden, a longing and desire for some object to which he did not allude. And now and then he would break short in what he was saying and lapse into reverie, entranced, as it seemed to me, by some distant prospect of adventurous discovery. The textbook was at last finished, and we began to receive proofs from the printers, which were entrusted to me for a first reading, and then underwent the final revision of the professor. All the while his weariness of the actual business he was engaged on increased, and it was with the joyous laugh of a schoolboy when term is over that he one day handed me a copy of the book. There, he said, I have kept my word. I promised to write it, and it is done with. Now I shall be free to live for stranger things. I confess it, Miss Lally, I covet the renown of Columbus. You will, I hope, see me play the part of an explorer. Surely, I said, there is little left to explore. You have been born a few hundred years too late for that. I think you are wrong, he replied. There are still, depend upon it, quaint, undiscovered countries and continents of strange extent. Ah, Miss Lally, believe me, we stand amidst sacraments and mysteries full of awe, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. Life, believe me, is no simple thing, no mass of gray matter and congeries of veins and muscles to be laid naked by the surgeon's knife. Man is the secret which I am about to explore, and before I can discover him I must cross over weltering seas indeed, and oceans and the mists of many thousand years. You know the myth of the lost Atlantis. What if it be true, and I am destined to be called the discoverer of that wonderful land? I could see excitement boiling beneath his words, and in his face was the heat of the hunter. Before me stood a man who believed himself summoned to tourney with the unknown. A pang of joy possessed me when I reflected that I was to be in a way associated with him in the adventure, And I, too, burned with the lust of the chase, not pausing to consider that I knew not what we were to unshadow. The next morning, Professor Gregg took me into his inner study, where, ranged against the wall, stood a nest of pigeonholes, every drawer neatly labeled, and the results of years of toil classified in a few feet of space. Here, he said, is my life. Here are all the facts which I have gathered together with so much pains, and yet it is all nothing. No, nothing to what I am about to attempt. Look at this. And he took me to an old bureau, a piece fantastic and faded, which stood in a corner of the room. He unlocked the front and opened one of the drawers. A few scraps of paper, he went on, pointing to the drawer, and a lump of black stone, rudely annotated with queer marks and scratches. That is all that the drawer holds. Here you see is an old envelope with the dark red stamp of 20 years ago, but I have penciled a few lines at the back. Here is a sheet of manuscript, and here some cuttings from obscure local journals. And if you ask me the subject matter of the collection, it will not seem extraordinary. A servant girl at a farmhouse, who disappeared from her place and has never been heard of. A child supposed to have slipped down some old working on the mountains, some queer scribbling on a limestone rock, a man murdered with a blow from a strange weapon. Such is the scent I have to go upon. Yes, as you say, there is a ready explanation for all this. The girl may have run away to London, or Liverpool, or New York. The child may be at the bottom of the disused shaft, and the letters on the rock may be the idle whims of some vagrant. Yes, yes, I admit all that. But I know I hold the true key. Look! And he held out a slip of yellow paper. Characters found inscribed on a limestone rock on the gray hills, I read, and then there was a word erased, presumably the name of a county, and a date some 15 years back. Beneath was traced a number of uncouth characters, shaped somewhat like wedges or daggers, as strange and outlandish as the Hebrew alphabet. Now the seal, said Professor Gregg, and he handed me the black stone, a thing about 2 inches long, and something like an old-fashioned tobacco stopper, much enlarged. I held it up to the light, and saw to my surprise the characters on the paper repeated on the seal. Yes, said the professor, they are the same. And the marks on the limestone rock were made 15 years ago, with some red substance. And the characters on the seal are 4,000 years old at least. Perhaps much more. Is it a hoax? I said. No, I anticipated that. I was not to be led to give my life to a practical joke. I have tested the matter very carefully. Only one person besides myself knows of the mere existence of that black seal. Besides, there are other reasons which I cannot enter into now. But what does it all mean? I said. I cannot understand to what conclusion all this leads. My dear Miss Lally, that is a question that I would rather leave unanswered for some little time. Perhaps I shall never be able to say what secrets are held here in solution. A few vague hints, the outlines of village tragedies, a few marks done with red earth upon a rock, and an ancient seal. A queer set of data to go upon? Half a dozen pieces of evidence, and 20 years before even so much could be got together. And who knows what mirage or terra incognita may be beyond all this? I look across deep waters, Miss Lally, and the land beyond may be but a haze after all. But still I believe it is not so, and a few months will show whether I am right or wrong. He left me, and alone I endeavored to fathom the mystery, wondering to what goals such eccentric odds and ends of evidence could lead. I myself am not wholly devoid of imagination, and I had reason to respect the professor's solidity of intellect. Yet I saw in the contents of the drawers but the materials of fantasy, and vainly tried to conceive what theory could be founded on the fragments that had been placed before me. Indeed, I could discover in what I had heard and seen but the first chapter of an extravagant romance. And yet deep in my heart I burned with curiosity, and day after day I looked eagerly in Professor Gregg's face for some hint of what was to happen. It was one evening after dinner that the word came. "I hope you can make your preparations without much trouble," he said suddenly to me. "We shall be leaving here in a week's time." "Really?" I said in astonishment. "Where are we going?" "I have taken a country house in the west of England, not far from Kermain, a quiet little town, once a city, and the headquarters of a Roman legion. It is very dull there, but the country is pretty, and the air is wholesome." I detected a glint in his eyes and guessed that this sudden move had some relation to our conversation of a few days before. I shall just take a few books with me, said Professor Gregg. That is all. Everything else will remain here for our return. I have got a holiday, he went on, smiling at me, and I shan't be sorry to be quit for a time of my old bones and stones and rubbish. Do you know, he went on, I have been grinding away at facts for 30 years. It is time for fancies. The days passed quickly. I could see that the professor was all quivering with suppressed excitement, and I could scarce credit the eager appetence of his glance as we left the old manor house behind us and began our journey. We set out at midday, and it was in the dusk of the evening that we arrived at a little country station. I was tired and excited, and the drive through the lanes seems all a dream. First, the deserted streets of a forgotten village, while I heard Professor Gregg's voice talking of the Augustan Legion and the clash of arms and all the tremendous pomp that followed the eagles. Then the broad river swimming to full tide with the last afterglow glimmering duskily in the yellow water, the wide meadows, the cornfields whitening, and the deep lane winding on the slope between the hills and the water. At last we began to ascend, and the air grew rarer. I looked down and saw the pure white mist tracking the outline of the river like a shroud, and a vague and shadowy country. Imaginations and fantasy of swelling hills and hanging woods, and half-shaped outlines of hills beyond, and in the distance the glare of the furnace fire on the mountain, glowing by turns a pillar of shining flame and fading to a dull point of red. We were slowly mounting a carriage drive, and then there came to me the cool breath and the secret of the great wood that was above us. I seemed to wander in its deepest depths, and there was the sound of trickling water, the scent of the green leaves, and the breath of the summer night. The carriage stopped at last, and I could scarcely distinguish the form of the house, as I waited a moment at the pillared porch. The rest of the evening seemed a dream of strange things bounded by the great silence of the wood and the valley and the river. The next morning, when I awoke and looked out of the bow window of the big, old-fashioned bedroom, I saw under a gray sky a country that was still all mystery. The long, lovely valley, with the river winding in and out below, crossed in mid-vision by a medieval bridge of vaulted and buttressed stone, the clear presence of the rising ground beyond, and the woods that I had only seen in shadow the night before, seemed tinged with enchantment, and the soft breath of air that sighed in at the opened pane was like no other wind. I looked across the valley and beyond. Hill followed on hill as wave on wave, and here a faint blue pillar of smoke rose still in the morning air from the chimney of an ancient gray farmhouse. There was a rugged height crowned with dark firs, and in the distance I saw the white streak of a road that climbed and vanished into some unimagined country. But the boundary of all was a great wall of mountain, vast in the west, and ending like a fortress with a steep ascent and a domed tumulus clear against the sky. I saw Professor Gregg walking up and down the terrace path below the windows, and it was evident that he was reveling in the sense of liberty and the thought that he had for a while bidden goodbye to taskwork. When I joined him, there was exultation in his voice as he pointed out the sweep of valley and the river that wound beneath the lovely hills. Yes, he said, it is a strangely beautiful country, and to me, at least, it seems full of mystery. You have not forgotten the drawer I showed you, Miss Lally? No. And you have guessed that I have come here not merely for the sake of the children and the fresh air? I think I have guessed as much as that, I replied. But you must remember I do not know the mere nature of your investigations. And as for the connection between the search and this wonderful valley, it is past my guessing. He smiled queerly at me. You must not think I am making a mystery for the sake of mystery, he said. I do not speak out because, so far, there is nothing to be spoken, nothing definite, I mean, nothing that can be set down in hard black and white, as dull and sure and irreproachable as any blue book. And then I have another reason. Many years ago, a chance paragraph in a newspaper caught my attention and focused in an instant the vagrant thoughts and half-formed fancies of many idle and speculative hours into a certain hypothesis. I saw at once that I was treading on a thin crust. My theory was wild and fantastic in the extreme, and I would not for any consideration have written a hint of it for publication. After all, I may be following a rainbow. I may have been misled by the play of coincidence, but as I stand here in this mystic hush and silence, amidst the woods and wild hills, I am more than ever sure that I am hot on the scent. Come, it is time we went in. After all, I may be following a rainbow. I may have been misled by the play of coincidence, but as I stand here in this mystic hush and silence, amidst the woods and wild hills, I am more than ever sure that I am hot on the scent. Come, it is time we went in. To me, in all this, there was something both of wonder and excitement. I knew how in his ordinary work Professor Gregg moved step by step, testing every inch of the way, and never venturing on assertion without proof that was impregnable. Yet I divined, more from his glance and the vehemence of his tone than from the spoken word, that he had in his every thought the vision of the almost incredible continually with him. And I, who was with some share of imagination no little of a skeptic, offended at a hint of the marvelous, could not help asking myself whether he were cherishing a monomania and barring out from this one subject all the scientific method of his other life. Yet, with this image of mystery haunting my thoughts, I surrendered wholly to the charm of the country. Above the faded house on the hillside began the great forest, a long, dark line seen from the opposing hills, stretching above the river for many a mile from north to south, and yielding in the north to even wilder country, barren and savage hills, and ragged common land, a territory all strange and unvisited, and more unknown to Englishmen than the very heart of Africa. The space of a couple of steep fields alone separated the house from the woods, and the children were delighted to follow me up the long alleys of undergrowth, between smooth, pleached walls of shining beech, to the highest point in the wood, whence one looked on one side across the river and the rise and fall of the country to the great western mountain wall, and on the other over the surge and dip of the myriad trees of the forest, over level meadows and the shining yellow sea to the faint coast beyond. I used to sit at this point on the warm sunlit turf which marked the track of the Roman road, while the two children raced about hunting for the windberries that grew here and there on the banks. Here, beneath the deep blue sky and the great clouds rolling, like olden galleons with sails full-bellied, from the sea to the hills, as I listened to the whispered charm of the great and ancient wood, I lived solely for delight, and only remembered strange things when we would return to the house and find Professor Gregg either shut up in the little room he had made his study, or else pacing the terrace with the look, patient and enthusiastic, of the determined seeker. One morning, some 8 or 9 days after our arrival, I looked out of my window and saw the whole landscape transmuted before me. The clouds had dipped low and hidden the mountain in the west. A southern wind was driving the rain in shifting pillars up the valley, and the little brooklet that burst the hill below the house now raged, a red torrent, down to the river. We were perforce obliged to keep snug within doors, and when I had attended to my pupils, I sat down in the morning room, where the ruins of a library still encumbered an old-fashioned bookcase. I had inspected the shelves once or twice, but their contents had failed to attract me. Volumes of 18th-century sermons, an old book on farriery, a collection of poems by persons of quality, Prideaux's Connection, and an odd volume of Pope were the boundaries of the library, and there seemed little doubt that everything of interest or value had been removed. Now, however, in desperation, I began to re-examine the musty sheepskin and calf bindings and found, much to my delight, a fine old quarto printed by the Stephanie, containing the 3 books of Pomponius Mela, De Situ Orbis, and other of the ancient geographers. I knew enough of Latin to steer my way through an ordinary sentence, and I soon became absorbed in the odd mixture of fact and fancy, light shining on a little of the space of the world, and beyond, mist and shadow and awful forms. Glancing over the clear printed pages, my attention was caught by the heading of a chapter in Solinus, and I read the words, Mira de intimis gentibus Libii, de lapide hexacontolitho, the wonders of the people that inhabit the inner parts of Libya, and of the stone called 60 Stone. The odd title attracted me, and I read on, Gens ista avia et secreta habitat, in montibus horrendus fida mysteria celebrat. De hominibus nihil aliud illi preferent quam figurum, ob humano ritu porsus exulant, oderunt deum lucus. Strident podius quam loquuntur, Vox ab zona nec sine horror auditor. Lapide quodam gloriantur, quem hexacontalathon vocant, dicunt enim hunc lapidem sexaginta notas ostendera, cujus lapidus nomen secretum ineffable collant, quod exaxer. This folk, I translated to myself, dwells in remote and secret places, and celebrates foul mysteries on savage hills. Nothing have they in common with men save the face, and the customs of humanity are wholly strange to them, and they hate the sun. They hiss rather than speak. Their voices are harsh, and not to be heard without fear. They boast of a certain stone, which they call 60 stone, for they say that it displays 60 characters. And this stone has a secret, unspeakable name, which is Exaxer. I laughed at the queer inconsequence of all this, and thought it fit for Sinbad the Sailor, or other of the supplementary knights. When I saw Professor Gregg in the course of the day, I told him of my find in the bookcase and the fantastic rubbish I had been reading. To my surprise, he looked up at me with an expression of great interest. "That is really very curious," he said. "I have never thought it worthwhile to look into the old geographers, and I dare say I have missed a good deal." "Ah, that is the passage, is it? It seems a shame to rob you of your entertainment, but I really think I must carry off the book." The next day the professor called me to come to the study. I found him sitting at a table in the full light of the window, scrutinizing something very attentively with a magnifying glass. "Ah, Miss Lally," he began, "I want to use your eyes. This glass is pretty good, but not like my old one that I left in town. Would you mind examining the thing yourself and telling me how many characters are cut on it?" He handed me the object in his hand. I saw that it was the black seal he had shown me in London, and my heart began to beat with the thought that I was presently to know something. I took the seal, and, holding it up to the light, checked off the grotesque, dagger-shaped characters one by one. "I make 62, I said at last. 62? Nonsense. It's impossible. Ah, I see what you have done. You have counted that and that," and he pointed to 2 marks which I had certainly taken as letters with the rest. "Yes, yes," Professor Gregg went on, "but those are obviously scratches, done accidentally. I saw that at once." "Yes, then that's quite right. Thank you very much, Miss Lally." I was going away, rather disappointed at my having been called in merely to count the number of marks on the black seal, when suddenly there flashed into my mind what I had read in the morning. "But, Professor Gregg," I cried, breathless, "the seal, the seal. Why, it is the stone hexacontalithos that Solinus writes of. It is Exaxer." "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is. Or it may be a mere coincidence. It never does to be too sure, in these matters." Coincidence killed the professor. I went away puzzled by what I had heard, and as much as ever at a loss to find the ruling clue in this maze of strange evidence. For 3 days the bad weather lasted, changing from driving rain to a dense mist, fine and dripping, and we seemed to be shut up in a white cloud that veiled all the world away from us. All the while Professor Gregg was darkling in his room, unwilling, it appeared, to dispense confidences or talk of any kind, and I heard him walking to and fro with a quick, impatient step, as if he were in some way wearied of inaction. The 4th morning was fine, and at breakfast the professor said briskly, "We want some extra help about the house. A boy of 15 or 16, you know. There are a lot of little odd jobs that take up the maid's time which a boy could do much better." "The girls have not complained to me in any way," I replied. "Indeed, and said there was much less work than in London, owing to there being so little dust." "Ah, yes, they are very good girls, but I think we shall do much better with a boy. In fact, that is what has been bothering me for the last 2 days." "Bothering you?" I said in astonishment, for as a matter of fact, the professor never took the slightest interest in the affairs of the house. "Yes," he said, "the weather, you know. I really couldn't go out in that Scotch mist. I don't know the country very well, and I should have lost my way. But I am going to get the boy this morning." "But how do you know there is such a boy as you want anywhere about?" "Oh, I have no doubt as to that. I may have to walk a mile or 2 at the most, but I am sure to find just the boy I require." I thought the professor was joking, but, though his tone was airy enough, there was something grim and set about his features that puzzled me. He got his stick, and stood at the door looking meditatively before him, and as I passed through the hall he called to me. By the way, Miss Lally, there was one thing I wanted to say to you. I dare say you may have heard that some of these country lads are not overbright, idiotic, would be a harsh word to use, and they are usually called naturals or something of the kind. I hope you won't mind if the boy I am after should turn out not too keen-witted. He will be perfectly harmless, of course, and blacking boots doesn't need much mental effort. With that he was gone, striding up the road that led to the wood, and I remained stupefied. And then for the first time my astonishment was mingled with a sudden note of terror, arising I knew not whence, and all unexplained even to myself, and yet I felt about my heart for an instant something of the chill of death, and that shapeless, formless dread of the unknown that is worse than death itself. I tried to find courage in the sweet air that blew up from the sea, and in the sunlight after rain, but the mystic woods seemed to darken around me, and the vision of the river coiling between the reeds and the silver gray of the ancient bridge fashioned in my mind symbols of vague dread, as the mind of a child fashions terror from things harmless and familiar. 2 hours later, Professor Gregg returned. I met him as he came down the road and asked quietly if he had been able to find a boy. "Oh, yes," he answered. "I found one easily enough. His name is Gervais Craddock, and I expect he will make himself very useful. His father has been dead for many years, and the mother, whom I saw, seemed very glad at the prospect of a few shillings extra coming in on Saturday nights. As I expected, he is not too sharp, has fits at times, the mother said. But as he will not be trusted with the china, that doesn't much matter, does it? And he is not in any way dangerous, merely a little weak. When is he coming?" "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and we'll show him what he has to do and how to do it. At first he will go home every night, but perhaps it may ultimately turn out more convenient for him to sleep here and only go home for Sundays." I found nothing to say to all this. Professor Gregg spoke in a quiet tone of matter of fact, as indeed was warranted by the circumstance. And yet I could not quell my sensation of astonishment at the whole affair. I knew that in reality no assistance was wanted in the housework, and the professor's prediction that the boy he was to engage might prove a little simple, followed by so exact a fulfillment, struck me as bizarre in the extreme. The next morning I heard from the housemaid that the boy Craddock had come at 8, and that she had been trying to make him useful. "He doesn't seem quite all there, I don't think, miss," was her comment, and later in the day, I saw him helping the old man who worked in the garden. He was a youth of about 14, with black hair and black eyes and an olive skin, and I saw at once from the curious vacancy of his expression that he was mentally weak. He touched his forehead awkwardly as I went by, and I heard him answering the gardener in a queer, harsh voice that caught my attention. It gave me the impression of someone speaking deep below under the earth, and there was a strange sibilance, like the hissing of the phonograph as the pointer travels over the cylinder. I heard that he seemed anxious to do what he could, and was quite docile and obedient, and Morgan the gardener, who knew his mother, assured me he was perfectly harmless. "He's always been a bit queer," he said, "and no wonder. After what his mother went through before he was born. I did know his father, Thomas Craddock, well, and a very fine workman he was too, indeed. He got something wrong with his lungs owing to working in the wet woods, and never got over it, and went off quite sudden-like. And they do say as how Mrs. Craddock was quite off her head. Anyhow, she was found by Mr. Hillier, Tycock, all crouched up on the gray hills, over there, crying and weeping like a lost soul. And Gervais, he was born about 8 months afterwards, and, as I was saying, he was a bit queer always. And they do say when he could scarcely walk he would frighten the other children into fits with the noises he would make. A word in the story had stirred up some remembrance within me, and vaguely curious, I asked the old man where the gray hills were. "Up there," he said, with the same gesture he had used before. "You go past the Fox and Hounds, and through the forest, by the old ruins. It's a good 5 mile from here, and a strange sort of a place. The poorest soil between this and Monmouth, they do say, though it's good feed for sheep." Yes, it was a sad thing for poor Mrs. Craddock. The old man turned to his work, and I strolled on down the path between the espaliers, gnarled and gouty with age, thinking of the story I had heard, and groping for the point in it that had some key to my memory. In an instant, it came before me. I had seen the phrase "gray hills" on the slip of yellowed paper that Professor Gregg had taken from the drawer in his cabinet. Again, I was seized with pangs of mingled curiosity and fear. I remembered the strange characters copied from the limestone rock, and then again their identity with the inscription of the age-old seal, and the fantastic fables of the Latin geographer. I saw beyond doubt that, unless coincidence had set all the scene and disposed all these bizarre events with curious art, I was to be a spectator of things far removed from the usual and customary traffic and jostle of life. Professor Gregg I noted day by day. He was hot on his trail, growing lean with eagerness, and in the evenings, when the sun was swimming on the verge of the mountain, he would pace the terrace to and fro with his eyes on the ground, while the mist grew white in the valley, and the stillness of the evening brought far voices near, and the blue smoke rose a straight column from the diamond-shaped chimney of the gray farmhouse, just as I had seen it on the first morning. I have told you I was of skeptical habit, but though I understood little or nothing, I began to dread, vainly proposing to myself the iterated dogmas of science that all life is material, and that in the system of things there is no undiscovered land, even beyond the remotest stars, where the supernatural can find a footing. Yet there struck in on this the thought that matter is as really awful and unknown as spirit, that science itself but dallies on the threshold, scarcely gaining more than a glimpse of the wonders of the inner place. There is one day that stands up from amidst the others as a grim red beacon, betokening evil to come. I was sitting on a bench in the garden, watching the boy Craddock weeding, when I was suddenly alarmed by a harsh and choking sound, like the cry of a wild beast in anguish, and I was unspeakably shocked to see the unfortunate lad standing in full view before me, his whole body quivering and shaking at short intervals as though shocks of electricity were passing through him, his teeth grinding, foam gathering on his lips, and his face all swollen and blackened to a hideous mask of humanity. I shrieked with terror, and Professor Gregg came running. And as I pointed to Craddock, the boy with one convulsive shudder fell face forward and lay on the wet earth, his body writhing like a wounded blind worm, and an inconceivable babble of sounds bursting and rattling and hissing from his lips. He seemed to pour forth an infamous jargon, with words, or what seemed words, that might have belonged to a tongue dead since untold ages and buried deep beneath Nilotic mud, or in the inmost recesses of the Mexican forest. For a moment the thought passed through my mind, as my ears were still revolted with that infernal clamor, surely this is the very speech of hell. And then I cried out again and again, and ran away shuddering to my inmost soul. I had seen Professor Gregg's face as he stooped over the wretched boy and raised him, and I was appalled by the glow of exultation that shone on every lineament and feature. As I sat in my room with drawn blinds, and my eyes hidden in my hands, I heard heavy steps beneath, and I was told afterwards that Professor Gregg had carried Craddock to his study and had locked the door. I heard voices murmur indistinctly, and I trembled to think of what might be passing within a few feet of where I sat. I longed to escape to the woods and sunshine, and yet I dreaded the sights that might confront me on the way. And at last, as I held the handle of the door nervously, I heard Professor Gregg's voice calling to me with a cheerful ring. "It's all right now, Miss Lally," he said. "The poor fellow has got over it, and I have been arranging for him to sleep here after tomorrow. Perhaps I may be able to do something for him." "Yes," he said later, "it was a very painful sight, and I don't wonder you were alarmed. We may hope that good food will build him up a little, but I am afraid he will never be really cured." And he affected the dismal and conventional air with which one speaks of hopeless illness. And yet beneath it I detected the delight that leapt up rampant within him, and fought and struggled to find utterance. It was as if one glanced down on the even surface of the sea, clear and immobile, and saw beneath raging depths and a storm of contending billows. It was indeed to me a torturing and offensive problem that this man, who had so bounteously rescued me from the sharpness of death, and showed himself in all the relations of life full of benevolence and pity and kindly forethought, should so manifestly be for once on the side of the demons, and take a ghastly pleasure in the torments of an afflicted fellow creature. Apart, I struggled with the horned difficulty, and strove to find the solution. But without the hint of a clue, beset by mystery and contradiction, I saw nothing that might help me and began to wonder whether, after all, I had not escaped from the white mist of the suburb at too dear a rate. I hinted something of my thought to the professor. I said enough to let him know that I was in the most acute perplexity, but the moment after regretted what I had done when I saw his face contort with a spasm of pain. "My dear Miss Lally," he said, "you surely do not wish to leave us? No, no, you would not do it. You do not know how I rely on you, how confidently I go forward, assured that you are here to watch over my children. You, Miss Lally, are my rear guard. For let me tell you, the business in which I am engaged is not wholly devoid of peril. You have not forgotten what I said the first morning here. My lips are shut by an old and firm resolve till they can open to utter no ingenious hypothesis or vague surmise, but irrefragable fact, as certain as a demonstration in mathematics. Think over it, Miss Lally. Not for a moment would I endeavor to keep you here against your own instincts, and yet I tell you frankly that I am persuaded it is here amidst the woods, that your duty lies." I was touched by the eloquence of his tone, and by the remembrance that the man, after all, had been my salvation, and I gave him my hand on a promise to serve him loyally and without question. A few days later the rector of our church, a little church, gray and severe and quaint, that hovered on the very banks of the river and watched the tides swim and return, came to see us, and Professor Gregg easily persuaded him to stay and share our dinner. Mr. Merrick was a member of an antique family of squires, whose old manor house stood amongst the hills some 7 miles away, and thus rooted in the soil, the rector was a living store of all the old fading customs and lore of the country. His manner, genial, with a deal of retired oddity, won on Professor Gregg, and towards the cheese, when a curious Burgundy had begun its incantations, the two men glowed like the wine, and talked of philology with the enthusiasm of a burgess over the peerage. The parson was expounding the pronunciation of the Welsh ll, and producing sounds like the gurgle of his native brooks, when Professor Gregg struck in. "By the way," he said, "that was a very odd word I met with the other day. You know my boy, poor Gervase Craddock? Well, he has got the bad habit of talking to himself, and the day before yesterday I was walking in the garden here and heard him. He was evidently quite unconscious of my presence. A lot of what he said I couldn't make out, but one word struck me distinctly. It was such an odd sound, half sibilant, half guttural, and as quaint as those double L's you have been demonstrating. I do not know whether I can give you an idea of the sound. Ishakshar is perhaps as near as I can get, but the K ought to be a Greek chi or a Spanish j. Now what does it mean in Welsh?" "In Welsh," said the parson, "there is no such word in Welsh, nor any word remotely resembling it. I know the book Welsh, as they call it, and the colloquial dialects as well as any man, but there's no word like that from Anglesey to Usk. Besides, none of the Craddocks speak a word of Welsh. It's dying out about here. Really, you interest me extremely, Mr. Merrick. I confess the word didn't strike me as having the Welsh ring, but I thought it might be some local corruption. No, I never heard such a word, or anything like it. Indeed," he added, smiling whimsically, "if it belongs to any language, I should say it must be that of the fairies, the Tylwydd Teg, as we call them." The talk went on to the discovery of a Roman villa in the neighborhood, and soon after I left the room, and sat down apart to wonder at the drawing together of such strange clues of evidence. As the professor had spoken of the curious word, I had caught the glint in his eye upon me, and though the pronunciation he gave was grotesque in the extreme, I recognized the name of the stone of 60 characters mentioned by Solinus, the black seal shut up in some secret drawer of the study, stamped forever by a vanished race with signs that no man could read, signs that might, for all I knew, be the veils of awful things done long ago, and forgotten before the hills were molded into form. When the next morning I came down, I found Professor Gregg pacing the terrace in his eternal walk. "Look at that bridge," he said, when he saw me. "Observe the quaint and Gothic design, the angles between the arches, and the silvery gray of the stone in the awe of the morning light. I confess it seems to me symbolic. It should illustrate a mystical allegory of the passage from one world to another. Professor Gregg, I said quietly, it is time that I knew something of what has happened and of what is to happen. For the moment he put me off, but I returned again with the same question in the evening, and then Professor Gregg flamed with excitement. Don't you understand yet? He cried. But I have told you a good deal. Yes, and shown you a good deal. You have heard pretty nearly all that I have heard, and seen what I have seen. Or at least, and his voice chilled as he spoke, enough to make a good deal clear as noonday. The servants told you, I have no doubt, that the wretched boy Craddock had another seizure the night before last. He awoke me with cries in that voice you heard in the garden, and I went to him. And God forbid you should see what I saw that night. But all this is useless. My time here is drawing to a close. I must be back in town in 3 weeks, as I have a course of lectures to prepare and need all my books about me. In a very few days it will be all over, and I shall no longer hint and no longer be liable to ridicule as a madman and a quack. No, I shall speak plainly, and I shall be heard with such emotions as perhaps no other man has ever drawn from the breasts of his fellows. He paused, and seemed to grow radiant with the joy of great and wonderful discovery. But all that is for the future, the near future certainly, but still the future, he went on at length. There is something to be done yet. You will remember my telling you that my researches were not altogether devoid of peril? Yes, there is a certain amount of danger to be faced. I did not know how much when I spoke on the subject before, and to a certain extent I am still in the dark. But it will be a strange adventure, the last of all, the last demonstration in the chain. He was walking up and down the room as he spoke, and I could hear in his voice the contending tones of exultation and despondence. Or perhaps I should say awe, the awe of a man who goes forth on unknown waters, and I thought of his allusion to Columbus on the night he had laid his book before me. The evening was a little chilly, and a fire of logs had been lighted in the study where we were. The remittent flame and the glow on the walls reminded me of the old days. I was sitting silent in an armchair by the fire, wondering over all I had heard, and still vainly speculating as to the secret springs concealed from me under all the phantasmagoria I had witnessed, when I became suddenly aware of a sensation that change of some sort had been at work in the room, and that there was something unfamiliar in its aspect. For some time I looked about me, trying in vain to localize the alteration that I knew had been made. The table by the window, the chairs, the faded settee were all as I had known them. Suddenly, as a sought-for recollection flashes into the mind, I knew what was amiss. I was facing the professor's desk, which stood on the other side of the fire, and above the desk was a grimy-looking bust of Pitt that I had never seen there before. And then I remembered the true position of this work of art. In the furthest corner by the door was an old cupboard, projecting into the room, and on the top of the cupboard, 15 feet from the floor, the bust had been, and there, no doubt, it had delayed, accumulating dirt, since the early days of the century. I was utterly amazed and sat silent, still in a confusion of thought. There was, so far as I knew, no such thing as a stepladder in the house, for I had asked for one to make some alteration in the curtains of my room, and a tall man standing on a chair would have found it impossible to take down the bust. It had been placed, not on the edge of the cupboard, but far back against the wall, and Professor Gregg was, if anything, under the average height. How on earth did you manage to get down Pitt? I said at last. The professor looked curiously at me and seemed to hesitate a little. They must have found you a stepladder, or perhaps the gardener brought in a short ladder from outside? No, I have had no ladder of any kind. Now, Miss Lally, he went on with an awkward simulation of jest, there is a little puzzle for you. A problem in the manner of the inimitable Holmes. There are the facts, plain and patent. Summon your acuteness to the solution of the puzzle. For heaven's sake, he cried with a breaking voice, say no more about it. I tell you, I never touched the thing. And he went out of the room with horror manifest on his face, and his hand shook and jarred the door behind him. I looked round the room in vague surprise, not at all realizing what had happened, making vain and idle surmises by way of explanation, and wondering at the stirring of black waters by an idle word and the trivial change of an ornament. This is some petty business, Some whim on which I have jarred, I reflected. The professor is perhaps scrupulous and superstitious over trifles, and my question may have outraged unacknowledged fears, as though one killed a spider or spilled the salt before the very eyes of a practical Scotchwoman. I was immersed in these fond suspicions, and began to plume myself a little on my immunity from such empty fears, when the truth fell heavily as lead upon my heart, and I recognized with cold terror that some awful influence had been at work. The bust was simply inaccessible. Without a ladder, no one could have touched it. I went out to the kitchen and spoke as quietly as I could to the housemaid. "Who moved that bust from the top of the cupboard, and?" I said to her. "Professor Gregg says he has not touched it. Did you find an old stepladder in one of the outhouses?" The girl looked at me blankly. "I never touched it," she said. "I found it where it is now the other morning when I dusted the room. I remember now, it was Wednesday morning, because it was the morning after Craddock was taken bad in the night. My room is next to his, you know, miss," the girl went on piteously, "and it was awful to hear how he cried and called out names that I couldn't understand. It made me feel all afraid. And then master came, and I heard him speak, and he took down Craddock to the study and gave him something." "And you found that bust moved the next morning?" "Yes, miss. There was a queer sort of smell in the study when I came down and opened the windows. A bad smell it was, and I wondered what it could be. Do you know, miss, I went a long time ago to the zoo in London with my cousin Thomas Barker, one afternoon that I had off, when I was at Mrs. Prince's in Stanhope Gate, and we went into the snake house to see the snakes, and it was just the same sort of smell. Very sick it made me feel, I remember, and I got Barker to take me out. And it was just the same kind of smell in the study, as I was saying, and I was wondering what it could be from, when I see that bust with pit cut in it, standing on the master's desk, and I thought to myself, now who has done that and how have they done it? And when I came to dust the things, I looked at the bust, and I saw a great mark on it where the dust was gone. For I don't think it can have been touched with a duster for years and years, and it wasn't like finger marks, but a large patch like broad and spread out. So I passed my hand over it, without thinking what I was doing. And where that patch was, it was all sticky and slimy, as if a snail had crawled over it. Very strange, isn't it, miss? And I wonder who can have done it, and how that mess was made. The well-meant gabble of the servant touched me to the quick. I lay down upon my bed, and bit my lip that I should not cry out loud in the sharp anguish of my terror and bewilderment. Indeed, I was almost mad with dread. I believe that if it had been daylight I should have fled hot-foot, forgetting all courage and all the debt of gratitude that was due to Professor Gregg, not caring whether my fate were that I must starve slowly, so long as I might escape from the net of blind and panic fear that every day seemed to draw a little closer round me. If I knew, I thought, if I knew what there was to dread, I could guard against it. But here, in this lonely house, shut in on all sides by the olden woods and the vaulted hills, terror seems to spring inconsequent from every covert, and the flesh is aghast at the half-hearted murmurs of horrible things. All in vain I strove to summon skepticism to my aid, and endeavored by cool common sense to buttress my belief in a world of natural order. For the air that blew in at the open window was a mystic breath, and in the darkness I felt the silence go heavy and sorrowful as a mass of requiem, and I conjured images of strange shapes gathering fast amidst the reeds beside the wash of the river. In the morning, from the moment that I set foot in the breakfast room, I felt that the unknown plot was drawing to a crisis. The professor's face was firm and set, and he seemed hardly to hear our voices when we spoke. "I am going out for a rather long walk," he said, when the meal was over. "You mustn't be expecting me now, or thinking anything has happened if I don't turn up to dinner. I have been getting stupid lately, and I dare say a miniature walking tour will do me good. Perhaps I may even spend the night in some little inn, if I find any place that looks clean and comfortable." I heard this, and knew by my experience of Professor Gregg's manner that it was no ordinary business of pleasure that impelled him. I knew not, nor even remotely guessed, where he was bound, nor had I the vaguest notion of his errand, but all the fear of the night before returned. And as he stood, smiling, on the terrace, ready to set out, I implored him to stay, and to forget all his dreams of the undiscovered continent. "No, no, Miss Lally," he replied, still smiling, It's too late now. Vestigia nulla retrorsum, is the device of all true explorers, though I hope it won't be literally true in my case. But, indeed, you are wrong to alarm yourself so. I look upon my little expedition as quite commonplace, no more exciting than a day with the geological hammers. There is a risk, of course, but so there is on the commonest excursion. I can afford to be jaunty. I am doing nothing so hazardous as Airy does 100 times over in the course of every bank holiday. Well then, you must look more cheerfully. And so goodbye till tomorrow at latest. He walked briskly up the road, and I saw him open the gate that marks the entrance of the wood, and then he vanished in the gloom of the trees. All the day passed heavily with a strange darkness in the air, and again I felt as if imprisoned amidst the ancient woods, shut in an olden land of mystery and dread, and as if all was long ago and forgotten by the living outside. I hoped and dreaded. And when the dinner hour came I waited, expecting to hear the professor's step in the hall, and his voice exulting at I knew not what triumph. I composed my face to welcome him gladly, but the night descended dark, and he did not come. In the morning, when the maid knocked at my door, I called out to her, and asked if her master had returned. And when she replied that his bedroom door stood open and empty, I felt the cold clasp of despair. Still, I fancied he might have discovered genial company, and would return for luncheon, or perhaps in the afternoon, and I took the children for a walk in the forest, and tried my best to play and laugh with them, and to shut out the thoughts of mystery and veiled terror. Hour after hour I waited, and my thoughts grew darker. Again the night came and found me watching, and at last, as I was making much ado to finish my dinner, I heard steps outside and the sound of a man's voice. The maid came in and looked oddly at me. "Please, miss," she began, "Mr. Morgan, the gardener, wants to speak to you for a minute, if you didn't mind." "Show him in, please," I answered, and set my lips tight. The old man came slowly into the room, and the servant shut the door behind him. "Sit down, Mr. Morgan," I said. "What is it that you want to say to me?" "Well, miss, Mr. Gregg, he gave me something for you yesterday morning, just before he went off, and he told me particular not to hand it up before 8 o'clock this evening exactly, if so be as he wasn't back again home before, and if he should come home before I was just to return it to him in his own hands. So, you see, as Mr. Gregg isn't here yet, I suppose I'd better give you the parcel directly." He pulled out something from his pocket and gave it to me, half rising. I took it silently, and seeing that Morgan seemed doubtful as to what he was to do next, I thanked him and bade him good night, and he went out. I was left alone in the room with the parcel in my hand. A paper parcel, neatly sealed and directed to me, with the instructions Morgan had quoted, all written in the professor's large, loose hand. I broke the seals with a choking at my heart and found an envelope inside, addressed also, but open, and I took the letter out. "My dear Miss Lally," it began. "To quote the old logic manual, the case of your reading this note is a case of my having made a blunder of some sort, and, I am afraid, a blunder that turns these lines into a farewell. It is practically certain that neither you nor anyone else will ever see me again. I have made my will with provision for this eventuality, and I hope you will consent to accept the small remembrance addressed to you, and my sincere thanks for the way in which you joined your fortunes to mine. The fate which has come upon me is desperate and terrible beyond the remotest dreams of man. But this fate you have a right to know, if you please. If you look in the left-hand drawer of my dressing table, you will find the key of the escritoire, properly labeled. In the well of the escritoire is a large envelope sealed and addressed to your name. I advise you to throw it forthwith into the fire. You will sleep better of nights if you do so. But if you must know the history of what has happened, it is all written down for you to read." The signature was firmly written below, and again I turned the page and read out the words one by one, aghast and white to the lips, my hands cold as ice, and sickness choking me. The dead silence of the room, and the thought of the dark woods and hills closing me in on every side, oppressed me, helpless and without capacity, and not knowing where to turn for counsel. At last I resolved that though knowledge should haunt my whole life and all the days to come, I must know the meaning of the strange terrors that had so long tormented me, rising gray, dim, and awful, like the shadows in the wood at dusk. I carefully carried out Professor Gregg's directions, and not without reluctance broke the seal of the envelope and spread out his manuscript before me. That manuscript I always carry with me, and I see that I cannot deny your unspoken request to read it. This, then, was what I read that night, sitting at the desk with a shaded lamp beside me. The young lady who called herself Miss Lally then proceeded to recite the statement of William Gregg, FRS, etc. It is many years since the first glimmer of the theory which is now almost, if not quite, reduced to fact dawned on my mind. A somewhat extensive course of miscellaneous and obsolete reading had done a great deal to prepare the way, and later, when I became somewhat of a specialist and immersed myself in the studies known as ethnological, I was now and then startled by facts that would not square with orthodox scientific opinion and by discoveries that seemed to hint at something still hidden for all our research. More particularly, I became convinced that much of the folklore of the world is but an exaggerated account of events that really happened, and I was especially drawn to consider the stories of the fairies, the good folk of the Celtic races. Here, I thought I could detect the fringe of embroidery and exaggeration, the fantastic guys, the little people dressed in green and gold sporting in the flowers, and I thought I saw a distinct analogy between the name given to this race, supposed to be imaginary, and the description of their appearance and manners. Just as our remote ancestors called the dreaded beings fair and good precisely because they dreaded them, so they had dressed them up in charming forms, knowing the truth to be the very reverse. Literature, too, had gone early to work and had lent a powerful hand in the transformation, so that the playful elves of Shakespeare are already far removed from the true original, and the real horror is disguised in a form of prankish mischief. But in the older tales, the stories that used to make men cross themselves as they sat around the burning logs, we tread a different stage. I saw a widely opposed spirit in certain histories of children and of men and women who vanished strangely from the earth. They would be seen by a peasant in the fields walking towards some green and rounded hillock and seen no more on earth. And there are stories of mothers who have left a child quietly sleeping, with the cottage door rudely barred with a piece of wood, and have returned, not to find the plump and rosy little Saxon, but a thin and wizened creature, with sallow skin and black, piercing eyes, the child of another race. Then, again, there were myths darker still, the dread of witch and wizard, the lurid evil of the Sabbath, and the hint of demons who mingled with the daughters of men. And just as we have turned the terrible fair folk into a company of benignant, if freakish elves, so we have hidden from us the black foulness of the witch and her companions under a popular diablerie of old women and broomsticks, and a comic cat with tail on end. So the Greeks called the hideous furies benevolent ladies, and thus the northern nations have followed their example. I pursued my investigations, stealing odd hours from other and more imperative labors, and I asked myself the question: supposing these traditions to be true, who were the demons who were reported to have attended the Sabbaths? I need not say that I laid aside what I may call the supernatural hypothesis of the Middle Ages and came to the conclusion that fairies and devils were of one and the same race and origin. Invention, no doubt, and the Gothic fancy of old days had done much in the way of exaggeration and distortion. Yet I firmly believe that beneath all this imagery there was a black background of truth. As for some of the alleged wonders, I hesitated. While I should be very loath to receive any one specific instance of modern spiritualism as containing even a grain of the genuine, yet I was not wholly prepared to deny that human flesh may now and then, once perhaps in 10 millions cases, be the veil of powers which seem magical to us, powers which, so far from proceeding from the heights and leading men thither, are in reality survivals from the depths of being. The amoeba and the snail have powers which we do not possess, and I thought it possible that the theory of reversion might explain many things which seem wholly inexplicable. Thus stood my position. I saw good reason to believe that much of the tradition, a vast deal of the earliest and uncorrupted tradition of the so-called fairies, represented solid fact, and I thought that the purely supernatural element in these traditions was to be accounted for on the hypothesis that a race which had fallen out of the grand march of evolution might have retained, as a survival, certain powers which would be to us wholly miraculous. Such was my theory as it stood conceived in my mind. And working with this in view, I seemed to gather confirmation from every side, from the spoils of a tumulus or a barrow, from a local paper reporting an antiquarian meeting in the country, and from general literature of all kinds. Amongst other instances, I remember being struck by the phrase articulate speaking men in Homer, as if the writer knew or had heard of men whose speech was so rude that it could hardly be termed articulate. And on my hypothesis of a race who had lagged far behind the rest, I could easily conceive that such a folk would speak a jargon but little removed from the inarticulate noises of brute beasts. Thus I stood, satisfied that my conjecture was at all events not far removed from fact, when a chance paragraph in a small country print one day arrested my attention. It was a short account of what was to all appearance the usual sordid tragedy of the village. A young girl unaccountably missing, an evil rumor blatant and busy with her reputation. Yet I could read between the lines that all this scandal was purely hypothetical, and in all probability invented to account for what was in any other manner unaccountable. A flight to London or Liverpool, or an undiscovered body lying with a weight about its neck in the foul depths of a woodland pool, or perhaps murder. Such were the theories of the wretched girl's neighbors. But as I idly scanned the paragraph, a flash of thought passed through me with the violence of an electric shock. What if the obscure and horrible race of the hills still survived, still remained haunting wild places and barren hills, and now and then repeating the evil of Gothic legend, unchanged and unchangeable as the Turanian Shelta or the Basques of Spain? I have said that the thought came with violence, and indeed I drew in my breath sharply, and clung with both hands to my elbow chair, in a strange confusion of horror and elation. It was as if one of my confreres of physical science, roaming in a quiet English wood, had been suddenly stricken aghast by the presence of the slimy and loathsome terror of the ichthyosaurus, the original of the stories of the awful worms killed by valorous knights, or had seen the sun darkened by the pterodactyl, the dragon of tradition. Yet as a resolute explorer of knowledge, the thought of such a discovery threw me into a passion of joy, and I cut out the slip from the paper and put it in a drawer in my old bureau, resolved that it should be but the first piece in a collection of the strangest significance. I sat long that evening dreaming of the conclusions I should establish, nor did cooler reflection at first dash my confidence. Yet as I began to put the case fairly, I saw that I might be building on an unstable foundation. The facts might possibly be in accordance with local opinion, and I regarded the affair with a mood of some reserve. Yet I resolved to remain perched on the lookout, and I hugged to myself the thought that I alone was watching and wakeful, while the great crowd of thinkers and searchers stood heedless and indifferent, perhaps letting the most prerogative facts pass by unnoticed. Several years elapsed before I was enabled to add to the contents of the drawer, and the second find was in reality not a valuable one, for it was a mere repetition of the first, with only the variation of another and distant locality. Yet I gained something, for in the second case, as in the first, the tragedy took place in a desolate and lonely country, and so far my theory seemed justified. But the third piece was to me far more decisive. Again, amongst outland hills, far even from a main road of traffic, an old man was found done to death, and the instrument of execution was left beside him. Here, indeed, there were rumor and conjecture, for the deadly tool was a primitive stone axe, bound by gut to the wooden handle, and surmises the most extravagant and improbable were indulged in. Yet, as I thought with a kind of glee, the wildest conjectures went far astray, and I took the pains to enter into correspondence with the local doctor, who was called at the inquest. He, a man of some acuteness, was dumbfounded. "It will not do to speak of these things in country places," he wrote to me. "But frankly, there is some hideous mystery here. I have obtained possession of the stone axe, and have been so curious as to test its powers. I took it into the back garden of my house one Sunday afternoon when my family and the servants were all out, and there, sheltered by the poplar hedges, I made my experiments. I found the thing utterly unmanageable. Whether there is some peculiar balance, some nice adjustment of weights, which require incessant practice, or whether an effectual blow can be struck only by a certain trick of the muscles, I do not know. But I can assure you that I went into the house with but a sorry opinion of my athletic capacities. I was like an inexperienced man putting the hammer. The force exerted seemed to return on oneself, and I found myself hurled backwards with violence, while the axe fell harmless to the ground. On another occasion, I tried the experiment with a clever woodman of the place. But this man, who had handled his axe for 40 years, could do nothing with the stone implement and missed every stroke most ludicrously. In short, if it were not so supremely absurd, I should say that for 4,000 years no one on earth could have struck an effective blow with the tool that undoubtedly was used to murder the old man. This, as may be imagined, was to me rare news, and afterwards, when I heard the whole story and learned that the unfortunate old man had babbled tales of what might be seen at night on a certain wild hillside, hinting at unheard of wonders, and that he had been found cold one morning on the very hill in question, my exultation was extreme, for I felt I was leaving conjecture far behind me. But the next step was of still greater importance. I had possessed for many years an extraordinary stone seal, a piece of dull black stone, 2 inches long from the handle to the stamp, and the stamping end a rough hexagon 1.25 inches in diameter. Altogether, it presented the appearance of an enlarged tobacco stopper of an old-fashioned make. It had been sent to me by an agent in the East, who informed me that it had been found near the site of the ancient Babylon. But the characters engraved on the seal were to me an intolerable puzzle. Somewhat of the cuneiform pattern, there were yet striking differences, which I detected at the first glance, and all efforts to read the inscription on the hypothesis that the rules for deciphering the arrow-headed writing would apply proved futile. A riddle such as this stung my pride, and at odd moments I would take the black seal out of the cabinet and scrutinize it with so much idle perseverance that every letter was familiar to my mind, and I could have drawn the inscription from memory without the slightest error. Judge, then, of my surprise when I one day received from a correspondent in the west of England a letter and an enclosure that positively left me thunderstruck. I saw carefully traced on a large piece of paper the very characters of the Black Seal, without alteration of any kind, and above the inscription my friend had written. Inscription found on a limestone rock on the Grey Hills, Monmouthshire. Done in some red earth, and quite recent. I turned to the letter. My friend wrote, "I send you the enclosed inscription with all due reserve. A shepherd who passed by the stone a week ago swears that there was then no mark of any kind. The characters, as I have noted, are formed by drawing some red earth over the stone, and are of an average height of 1 inch. They look to me like a kind of cuneiform character, a good deal altered. But this, of course, is impossible. It may be either a hoax, or more probably some scribble of the gypsies, who are plentiful enough in this wild country. They have, as you are aware, many hieroglyphics which they use in communicating with one another. I happened to visit the stone in question 2 days ago in connection with a rather painful incident which has occurred here. As it may be supposed, I wrote immediately to my friends, thanking him for the copy of the inscription and asking him in a casual manner the history of the incident he mentioned. To be brief, I heard that a woman named Craddock, who had lost her husband a day before, had set out to communicate the sad news to a cousin who lived some 5 miles away. She took a short cut which led by the Grey Hills. Mrs. Craddock, who was then quite a young woman, never arrived at her relative's house. Late that night a farmer, who had lost a couple of sheep, supposed to have wandered from the flock, was walking over the Grey Hills with a lantern and his dog. His attention was attracted by a noise which he described as a kind of wailing, mournful and pitiable to hear. And guided by the sound, he found the unfortunate Mrs. Craddock crouched on the ground by the limestone rock, swaying her body to and fro, and lamenting and crying in so heart-rending a manner that the farmer was, as he says, at first obliged to stop his ears, or he would have run away. The woman allowed herself to be taken home, and a neighbor came to see to her necessities. All the night she never ceased her crying, mixing her lament with words of some unintelligible jargon, and when the doctor arrived he pronounced her insane. She lay on her bed for a week, now wailing, as people said, like one lost and damned for eternity, and now sunk in a heavy coma. It was thought that grief at the loss of her husband had unsettled her mind, and the medical man did not at one time expect her to live. I need not say that I was deeply interested in this story, and I made my friend write to me at intervals with all the particulars of the case. I heard then that in the course of 6 weeks, the woman gradually recovered the use of her faculties, and some months later she gave birth to a son, christened Gervase, who unhappily proved to be of weak intellect. Such were the facts known to the village. But to me, while I whitened at the suggested thought of the hideous enormities that had doubtless been committed, all this was nothing short of conviction, and I incautiously hazarded a hint of something like the truth to some scientific friends. The moment the words had left my lips, I bitterly regretted having spoken, and thus given away the great secret of my life. But with a good deal of relief mixed with indignation, I found my fears altogether misplaced, for my friends ridiculed me to my face, and I was regarded as a madman. And beneath a natural anger, I chuckled to myself, feeling as secure amidst these blockheads as if I had confided what I knew to the desert sands. But now, knowing so much, I resolved I would know all, and I concentrated my efforts on the task of deciphering the inscription on the black seal. For many years I made this puzzle the sole object of my leisure moments, for the greater portion of my time was, of course, devoted to other duties, and it was only now and then that I could snatch a week of clear research. If I were to tell the full history of this curious investigation, this statement would be wearisome in the extreme, for it would contain simply the account of long and tedious failure. But with what I knew already of ancient scripts, I was well equipped for the chase, as I always termed it to myself. I had correspondents amongst all the scientific men in Europe, and indeed, in the world, and I could not believe that in these days any character, however ancient and however perplexed, could long resist the searchlight I should bring to bear upon it. Yet in point of fact, it was fully 14 years before I succeeded. With every year, my professional duties increased and my leisure became smaller. This no doubt retarded me a good deal. And yet, when I look back on those years, I am astonished at the vast scope of my investigation of the Black Seal. I made my bureau a center, and from all the world and from all the ages I gathered transcripts of ancient writing. Nothing, I resolved, should pass me unawares, and the faintest hint should be welcomed and followed up. But as one covert after another was tried and proved empty of result, I began in the course of years to despair, and to wonder whether the Black Seal were the sole relic of some race that had vanished from the world, and left no other trace of its existence. Had perished, in fine, as Atlantis is said to have done, in some great cataclysm, its secrets perhaps drowned beneath the ocean or molded into the heart of the hills. The thought chilled my warmth a little, and though I still persevered, it was no longer with the same certainty of faith. A chance came to the rescue. I was staying in a considerable town in the north of England, and took the opportunity of going over the very creditable museum that had for some time been established in the place. The curator was one of my correspondents, and, as we were looking through one of the mineral cases, my attention was struck by a specimen, a piece of black stone some 4 inches square, the appearance of which reminded me in a measure of the Black Seal. I took it up carelessly and was turning it over in my hand, when I saw, to my astonishment, that the underside was inscribed. I said, quietly enough, to my friend the curator that the specimen interested me, and that I should be much obliged if he would allow me to take it with me to my hotel for a couple of days. He, of course, made no objection, and I hurried to my rooms and found that my first glance had not deceived me. There were 2 inscriptions, one in the regular cuneiform character, another in the character of the Black Seal, and I realized that my task was accomplished. I made an exact copy of the 2 inscriptions, and when I got to my London study and had the seal before me, I was able seriously to grapple with the great problem. The interpreting inscription on the museum specimen, though in itself curious enough, did not bear on my quest, but the transliteration made me master of the secret of the Black Seal. Conjecture, of course, had to enter into my calculations. There was here and there uncertainty about a particular ideograph, and one sign recurring again and again on the seal baffled me for many successive nights. But at last the secret stood open before me in plain English, and I read the key of the awful transmutation of the hills. The last word was hardly written, when with fingers all trembling and unsteady I tore the scrap of paper into the minutest fragments, and saw them flame and blacken in the red hollow of the fire, and then I crushed the gray films that remained into finest powder. Never since then have I written those words. Never will I write the phrases which tell how man can be reduced to the slime from which he came, and be forced to put on the flesh of the reptile and the snake. There was now but one thing remaining. I knew, but I desired to see, and I was after some time able to take a house in the neighborhood of the Gray Hills, and not far from the cottage where Mrs. Craddock and her son Gervase resided. I need not go into a full and detailed account of the apparently inexplicable events which have occurred here where I am writing this. I knew that I should find in Gervase Craddock something of the blood of the little people, and I found later that he had more than once encountered his kinsman in lonely places in that lonely land. When I was summoned one day to the garden, and found him in a seizure speaking or hissing the ghastly jargon of the Black Seal, I am afraid that exultation prevailed over pity. I heard bursting from his lips the secrets of the underworld, and the word of dread, Ishakshar, signification of which I must be excused from giving. But there is one incident I cannot pass over unnoticed. In the waste hollow of the night I awoke at the sound of those hissing syllables I knew so well, and on going to the wretched boy's room, I found him convulsed and foaming at the mouth, struggling on the bed as if he strove to escape the grasp of writhing demons. I took him down to my room and lit the lamp, while he lay twisting on the floor, calling on the power within his flesh to leave him. I saw his body swell and become distended as a bladder, while the face blackened before my eyes. And then at the crisis I did what was necessary according to the directions on the seal, and putting all scruple on one side, I became a man of science, observant of what was passing. Yet the sight I had to witness was horrible, almost beyond the power of human conception and the most fearful fantasy. Something pushed out from the body there on the floor and stretched forth a slimy, wavering tentacle across the room, grasped the bust upon the cupboard, and laid it down on my desk. When it was over, and I was left to walk up and down all the rest of the night, white and shuddering, with sweat pouring from my flesh, I vainly tried to reason within myself. I said, truly enough, that I had seen nothing really supernatural, that a snail pushing out his horns and drawing them in was but an instance on a smaller scale of what I had witnessed. And yet horror broke through all such reasonings and left me shattered and loathing myself for the share I had taken in the night's work. There is little more to be said. I am going now to the final trial and encounter, for I have determined that there shall be nothing wanting, and I shall meet the little people face to face. I shall have the Black Seal and the knowledge of its secrets to help me, and if I unhappily do not return from my journey, there is no need to conjure up here a picture of the awfulness of my fate. Pausing a little at the end of Professor Gregg's statement, Miss Lally continued her tale in the following words. Such was the almost incredible story that the professor had left behind him. When I had finished reading it, it was late at night, but the next morning I took Morgan with me, and we proceeded to search the Gray Hills for some trace of the lost professor. I will not weary you with a description of the savage desolation of that tract of country, a tract of utterest loneliness, of bare green hills dotted over with gray limestone boulders, worn by the ravages of time into fantastic semblances of men and beast. Finally, after many hours of weary searching, we found what I told you, the watch and chain and purse and the ring, wrapped in a piece of coarse parchment. When Morgan cut the gut that bound the parcel together, and I saw the professor's property, I burst into tears, but the sight of the dreaded characters of the Black Seal repeated on the parchment froze me to silent horror, and I think I understood for the first time the awful fate that had come upon my late employer. I have only to add that Professor Gregg's lawyer treated my account of what had happened as a fairy tale, and refused even to glance at the documents I laid before him. It was he who was responsible for the statement that appeared in the public press, to the effect that Professor Gregg had been drowned, and that his body must have been swept into the open sea. Miss Lally stopped speaking and looked at Mr. Phillips with a glance of some inquiry. He, for his part, was sunken in a deep reverie of thought, and when he looked up and saw the bustle of the evening gathering in the square, men and women hurrying to partake of dinner, and crowds already besetting the music halls, all the hum and press of actual life seemed unreal and visionary, a dream in the morning after an awakening. The end.